First story, The Last Order. The road stretching through the Arizona desert is the kind of place where people disappear without a trace. I never gave it much thought before, to be honest. I grew up in this dusty little town, the kind of place where the sky feels endless and the days melt into each other. I never thought anything exciting would happen here, let alone anything terrifying. But then I started working the night shift at Roxy's Diner. Roxy's was a place like any other along the highway. Neon signs flickered in the distance, luring in truckers and drifters with promises of strong coffee and hot meals. My boss, Dave, hired me last summer, short-staffed and needing an extra hand. I'd heard the locals talk about strange things happening around the diner, but they were always vague. Superstitions, really. After all, what else do people have to do out here except tell stories to pass the time? It was a slow night when I first noticed him. The clock on the wall above the counter showed 2:17 a.m. That's the hour when time drags and you start counting the minutes until the morning shift rolls in. It's also the hour when he always came. He sat at the booth by the window, the one with the view of the long, empty highway. He didn't order anything, never even glanced at the menu. Just sat there, staring out into the night, the dim glow of the diner's lights casting shadows across his face. At first, I figured he was just a trucker taking a break, maybe lost in his thoughts. But he never touched his coffee, he never even blinked. The first night I saw him, I didn't think much of it. People pass through Roxy's all the time and we get all sorts. But when he came back the next night, and the night after that, I started to pay more attention. It was always the same. The same booth, the same time, the same vacant expression as he stared out at the road. On my fourth night working, curiosity got the better of me. The diner was dead quiet, just the hum of the fridge and the buzz of the old neon sign outside. I grabbed the coffee pot and made my way over to his table. "Refill?" I asked, trying to sound casual, but there was something about the man that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. He looked up at me for the first time, and I swear, I felt a chill crawl down my spine. His eyes were hollow, like he wasn't really seeing me at all, just looking through me. I poured the coffee, though I knew he wouldn't drink it. "You come here a lot," I said, attempting to make conversation. "Don't think I've seen you eat anything, though." He didn't answer right away, just kept staring at the road. "Waiting for something?" I pressed, instantly regretting the question. He finally spoke, his voice low and rough like gravel underfoot. "Not waiting. Watching." "Watching for what?" I asked, half expecting some kind of vague trucker wisdom about life on the road. But what he said next made my heart skip a beat. "For them." I tried to laugh it off. "Them?" He didn't blink, didn't break eye contact. "They come at night, when the road's quiet. They always come when the lights in here flicker." He gestured toward the neon sign outside, which at that exact moment gave off a weak, erratic buzz before dimming slightly. It was just a coincidence, I told myself. Nothing more. But that moment felt too precise, too perfectly timed. I shrugged it off and left him alone. But from that night on, I couldn't stop thinking about what he'd said. The next night and the night after that, the man was back. And each time he'd drop a cryptic comment that made my skin crawl. "They take them, one by one. No one notices. Not until it's too late." Then the disappearances started. Truckers, travelers, people who passed through Roxy's. They'd eat, pay their bill, and head out onto the highway only to vanish. No wrecks, no bodies, just gone. It wasn't until I heard about the third missing person that I realized something was wrong. All of them had stopped at Roxy's just before they disappeared. I started to piece it together, but it wasn't enough to make sense of it. Not yet. One night, I decided to confront the man directly. There was no one else in the diner, just him, me, and the buzzing neon outside. I sat across from him, trying to ignore the way my hands trembled. "What's going on here?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. "You know something about these people, don't you?" His eyes, those cold, empty eyes, fixed on mine. He leaned in closer, and for the first time I noticed something off about his skin. It looked too pale, almost translucent in the dim light. "They're lost," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "And they're never coming back." "Who's taking them?" I pressed, feeling a knot of dread form in my stomach. He didn't answer. Instead, he glanced out the window again, just as the lights flickered once more. It was then that I heard it. A sound like distant footsteps, but too many at once, as if a crowd was approaching. I turned toward the window, but the highway was still empty, the desert stretching out into nothingness. The noise grew louder, closer, and I could feel something watching us from just beyond the diner's weak glow. I stood up, my legs shaking, but the man didn't move. His eyes remained fixed on the road. "It's too late," he murmured. "They're here." The lights flickered again, and in that moment of darkness, I felt them. Shadows shifting, figures moving just out of sight. I wanted to run, to scream, but my body was frozen in place. When the lights came back on, the man was gone, his booth empty, the coffee untouched as always. I haven't been back to Roxy's since that night. People keep disappearing, and no one seems to notice, no one except me. I can't shake the feeling that they're still out there, watching from the edges of the highway, waiting for the lights to flicker again. And I'm afraid that one day, they'll come for me too. Second story, the usual. I never liked the night shifts, especially during storms. There's something about the rain slamming against the windows, the wind howling through the trees outside, and the dark main sky that makes everything feel more isolated. Like the rest of the world just disappears, and it's only you, the rain, and whatever shadows the storm brings with it. That night at Maplewood Diner felt no different at first. It was a Tuesday, dead as usual. I had just started my shift around 7 p.m., and by 10, the place was nearly empty. Just 3 regulars sitting in their usual spots. Old Joe at the counter, nursing a cup of coffee that he pretended wasn't half whiskey. Carla, the truck driver, sitting near the jukebox, mindlessly flipping through an old magazine. And then there was Marcus, a high school teacher grading papers in the corner booth. Quiet people, lost in their own worlds, barely acknowledging each other. The rain came down in sheets outside, a relentless downpour that had been going on for hours. The kind of storm where the sky looks black as pitch and the road is just a blur of wet reflections. The clock on the wall above the counter showed 10:42 p.m., but it might as well have been 3 a.m. Time felt slow. The diner's soft yellow lights flickered every time lightning cracked in the distance, and I counted the seconds between the thunder just to pass the time. And then he walked in. The bell above the door jingled faintly as a man stumbled inside, drenched from head to toe. His clothes clung to him like he'd been out in the storm for hours, maybe longer. I couldn't see his face at first, just a soaked jacket and wet hair hanging in his eyes. But what caught my attention wasn't how wet he was. It was how calm he seemed, like he belonged there despite the chaos outside. He sat down at a booth by the window, his back to the storm, and looked straight at me. "I'll have the usual," he said, his voice low, almost mechanical. I blinked. Sure. What's the usual?" He didn't respond, just smiled, a small, almost knowing smile, and leaned back in his seat. I glanced over at Joe, Carla, and Marcus. None of them reacted. It was like they hadn't even noticed the guy come in. I walked over with the coffee pot. "You been here before?" I asked, pouring a cup. The guy still hadn't said what he wanted to eat, but he didn't seem in any hurry to answer either. He finally looked up at me, and that's when I noticed something off. His eyes. They were a little too dark, a little too empty, like there was something missing behind them. "I always come here," he said quietly. "It's been years now." I opened my mouth to ask another question, but before I could, the clock on the wall behind the counter made this strange clicking noise. I turned to look, thinking maybe the power had gone out. The hands on the clock were spinning wildly, like someone had cranked it up to fast forward. Seconds turned into minutes, and minutes into hours in the blink of an eye. I stood there, frozen, watching the time just slip away, faster and faster. When I looked back at the booth, the man was staring at me, unblinking. "It's starting again," he said, almost to himself. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. "I'll, get your food?" I muttered, heading toward the kitchen. But when I turned back, something stopped me cold. The diner, it didn't look right. The customers, the booths, even the jukebox, it was all wrong, like I was seeing everything through a warped lens. Joe was still at the counter, but his movements were jerky, like a film reel skipping frames. Carla's fingers turned the magazine pages in a slow, exaggerated motion, and Marcus? He hadn't moved at all, just sat there, staring at the same paper, his hand frozen in mid-grading. I could feel panic rising in my chest. What the hell is going on? I whispered, more to myself than anyone else. "That's the thing about this place," the man said, breaking the silence. He was standing now, his wet clothes dripping onto the floor, but I hadn't seen him move from the booth. "Time, it bends here, twists. We've all been through this before." Before? That word made my throat tighten. I looked outside, hoping the rain might give me some sense of normalcy, but even the storm seemed wrong now. The sky was darker than it should have been, almost unnatural, and the rain, it wasn't falling anymore. It was just hanging there, frozen in midair like someone had hit pause on the world outside. I backed up, my hands shaking. "What do you mean before? Who are you?" He stepped forward, his shoes squelching on the floor. "I've been coming here for longer than you can imagine. Every storm, every night like this, we all come back. We." I turned to the counter, looking for Joe, but he wasn't there. His cup sat untouched, still steaming, but he was gone. Carla's magazine was open, but the seat was empty. Even Marcus, who had been there, motionless, was no longer in his booth. The diner was empty except for me and him. Where did they go? I demanded, my voice trembling. "They're still here," he replied calmly. "They always will be." I didn't understand. None of this made any sense. My first instinct was to run, to get out of the diner and never look back. But when I lunged for the door, my hand hit something cold, something solid. The glass door wouldn't budge. I pounded on it, my fist echoing through the empty diner, but the world outside stayed frozen. No rain, no wind, no sound, just silence. And when I turned back to the man, he was standing right behind me, closer than he should have been. "You can't leave, Emma," he said softly, like he was breaking bad news to an old friend. "No one leaves once the storm begins." "How do you know my name?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I know all of you," he said. "I've been watching you for years." I backed away, fear closing in on me. "What do you want?" His eyes darkened further, as if the void inside him grew deeper with every second. "This place is a loop, Emma. We're all part of it. You, me, the others. We're bound to this storm, bound to this diner, and every night we play it out again." "No!" I shook my head, refusing to believe him. "This isn't real. This can't be real." But deep down, I knew. The strange shifts in time, the disappearing customers, the storm that never ended. It had all happened before, and it would happen again. And I was trapped. Third story, table 13. I'm not one to believe in urban legends. I've built my career on debunking them, finding the truth buried beneath years of exaggeration and small-town superstition. That's why, when I first heard about the legend of the Silver Spoon Diner and its infamous Mesa 13, I dismissed it as just another ghost story. Fallon, Nevada, isn't exactly a hotspot for mysteries, and yet, something about this one stuck with me. It was late when I arrived at the diner, 2:15 a.m. The Silver Spoon was one of those places that time had mostly forgotten. The red neon sign flickered faintly in the distance, casting eerie shadows on the empty parking lot. Inside, it was quiet, Too quiet for a diner that claimed to be open 24 hours. A bell rang weakly as I pushed open the door, the smell of old grease and burnt coffee filling the air. There were only two people inside. A grizzled old man hunched over a cup of coffee at the counter and a waitress who looked more tired than surprised to see me. I glanced around, noting the booths lining the windows, all except one. At the back, illuminated by the soft, flickering light above, sat Mesa 13. It was just a table, nothing special at first glance. But it felt wrong. I slid into a booth nearby and pulled out my notepad. The waitress approached, her eyes avoiding mine as she set down a menu. "What'll it be?" "Just coffee for now," I replied. "I'm actually here about the table." Mesa 13. Her hand froze for just a moment before she recovered, pouring my coffee with shaking fingers. "You shouldn't ask about that," she murmured, barely audible. "People don't like to talk about it." I pressed on. I heard the stories, people disappearing after sitting there late at night. But that's all it is, right? A story. Her eyes darted toward the old man at the counter, who hadn't moved an inch. "You should leave it alone," she whispered, her voice almost pleading. "Once you notice the table, it notices you back." Over the next few nights, I did my research. Locals didn't talk about it much, but old newspaper articles hinted at strange disappearances dating back decades. 1952 was the first documented case. A man named Henry Carter vanished one night after his shift. His car was found still parked outside the diner, but Henry was never seen again. The owner back then, a guy named Frank, had no explanation. "He sat at Mesa 13, was all he said. There were more stories, enough to form a pattern, but nothing concrete. Still, it was enough to keep me coming back. Each time, I sat a little closer to Mesa 13. Each time I felt a bit more uneasy. It wasn't just the table itself. It was the way the diner seemed to change when I was there. Lights flickered more often, the shadows seemed to stretch longer, and the few customers who came in late at night avoided eye contact with me. Then, one night, I made a mistake. It was around 3 a.m., the diner almost empty. The old man was gone, and the waitress had retreated to the back. I had been watching Mesa 13 for over an hour when I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I got up, crossed the room, and sat down at the table. First, nothing happened. The seat was cold, the air around me heavy with an unsettling stillness. I took out my notepad, jotting down every sensation, every observation. That's when I noticed something strange. My reflection in the window wasn't quite right. I stared at it. The diner behind me looked the same, but my reflection, it was distorted like a blurred photograph. I blinked, trying to clear my vision, but it only got worse. The figure in the window wasn't me anymore. It was someone else, someone much older, wearing an old-fashioned suit and a wide-brimmed hat. His face was gaunt, eyes sunken and dark, and though his mouth was twisted into a smile, there was something profoundly wrong about it. I shot up from the table, my heart pounding, but when I turned around, the diner was empty. Completely empty. No waitress, no customers, no sound. Just me. And yet I felt watched. "Sarah!" A voice whispered behind me. I froze. The voice was soft, barely audible, but unmistakable. It was the voice of an old man. Slowly, I turned back to face the window. The figure was gone, but the table, there was something on it now. A worn, yellowed photograph. I reached for it, hands trembling. The photo showed a group of men in front of the diner, dated 1952. And there, in the middle, was the man from the reflection. Henry Carter. Suddenly, the diner's bell rang. The door swung open, but no one stepped inside. The lights flickered, and for a moment, everything went dark. When the lights came back, the air had shifted. It was thicker, colder, and I wasn't alone. Figures sat in the other booths, their faces blurred, but I could feel their eyes on me. The diner felt like it was collapsing inward, the walls bending and warping as the shadows grew longer. And then, I heard it again, closer this time. "Sarah." I bolted for the door, stumbling into the night, but the cold air didn't bring relief. I turned back, expecting to see the diner, but it wasn't there anymore. Just an empty lot, overgrown with weeds, the diner's sign long extinguished. I haven't been back to Fallon since. Every time I try to write about what happened, my words twist into something that doesn't make sense. Friends tell me I've changed, that I seem distant, distracted. They're right, because no matter how far I run, I can still hear that voice, faint but persistent. I know now why people don't talk about Mesa 13. Once you sit there, you can never truly leave. Fourth story, the midnight shift. I've worked at the Route 66 diner for nearly 6 years. It's the kind of place that never changes. Sticky vinyl booths, a cracked tile floor, and a jukebox that hasn't played anything but static since I started. The stories of it being haunted, I never paid them much attention. There's always some legend tied to places like this. But that was before I covered the midnight shift. Normally, I worked the day shift, greasy eggs, endless coffee refills, and the steady hum of highway traffic. But when Carlos, the night cook, called in sick, my manager begged me to take his place. I wasn't thrilled, but extra hours meant extra cash. Besides, how bad could it be? Turns out the night shift is different. I clocked in at 11:45 p.m. The diner was dead, no pun intended. There wasn't a soul inside except for Janine, the waitress who worked nights. She barely looked up from her crossword as I tied on my apron. "Quiet tonight?" I asked, trying to make conversation. She nodded, eyes still on the paper. "Always is around this time, except for him." "Who?" Janine flicked her chin toward the far booth, by the window. I hadn't noticed it when I walked in, but there he was, a man, sitting alone, staring out into the empty parking lot. His clothes were old-fashioned, like something out of a photo from the 70s. He hadn't ordered anything, just sat there, still as a statue. "Is he a regular?" I asked, lowering my voice. Janine shrugged. "Comes in most nights around midnight. Always asks for the Thursday special." I frowned. "We don't have a Thursday special." She finally looked up at me, her eyes darker than I'd ever seen them. "Not anymore." That was the first thing that felt off, but I brushed it aside. I was here to cook, not worry about some old guy in a booth. Midnight hit and I headed back to the kitchen. That's when things got strange. It started with the voices. At first, it was just a faint whisper, barely loud enough to notice. I figured it was Janine talking to the guy in the booth. But when I peeked through the kitchen window, Janine was still at the counter, her back to me, and the man hadn't moved. I shook it off. Maybe it was a draft or the sound of the wind against the windows. Old buildings make weird noises. But then I heard it again, clearer this time. A child's laughter, faint but unmistakable, echoing from the back of the kitchen. I spun around, expecting to see someone, but there was no one there. Just rows of empty countertops and shelves stocked with canned goods. The laughter stopped, replaced by a cold silence that made the hairs on my neck stand up. That's when I noticed the plates. I had left a stack of dirty dishes by the sink, planning to clean them later. Now they were gone, washed, dried, and stacked neatly on the shelf. I hadn't touched them, and I sure as hell didn't hear the dishwasher running. "Janine," I called, stepping out of the kitchen. She looked up from her crossword, unfazed. "What? Did you clean the dishes?" She shook her head. "Haven't moved from this spot." I glanced back at the kitchen, my heart thudding in my chest. It didn't make sense. Someone had to be messing with me. Around 1 a.m., things got weirder. The man in the booth finally called out to Janine. His voice was low, like gravel grinding against metal. "I'll have the Thursday special," he said. I watched as Janine froze, her hand hovering over her notepad. She glanced back at me, her face pale, then leaned in toward the man. We don't serve that anymore," she stammered. He didn't respond. He just sat there, staring out the window, his reflection distorted in the glass. Janine quickly turned away and headed toward the counter, her face tense. I followed her, lowering my voice. "What the hell is the Thursday special?" Her lips pressed into a thin line. "It was taken off the menu years ago, after..." She hesitated, then shook her head. "Look, it's just an old dish. Fried chicken, mashed potatoes, something like that. But no one's ordered it in decades. Not since the accident." "Accident?" Janine's voice dropped to a whisper. "Back in '78, a school bus crashed just up the road. It was bringing kids from a field trip late at night. Some say the driver fell asleep at the wheel. Others claim it wasn't his fault, that something made him swerve. What happened to the kids?" Her eyes darted to the man in the booth, then back to me. "Most of them didn't make it, and ever since then, people say they see things, hear things, especially on the night shift." I felt a chill creep up my spine, but I still wasn't convinced. Ghost stories and diner lore, it was all part of the job, right? But then, around 2 a.m., it all went to hell. I was back in the kitchen, scrubbing the grill, when the lights flickered. The buzzing overhead lights cut in and out, casting long shadows that twisted and warped with every flash. Then the laughter came again, louder this time. Children's voices, high-pitched and playful, but echoing in a way that made my skin crawl. I spun around, and there, standing in the doorway to the kitchen, was a small figure, a child. His face was pale, his eyes wide and hollow. He wore an old-school jacket, the kind kids wore in the '70s, dirt-stained and torn. My breath caught in my throat. "Hey, kid, are you okay?" I whispered, my voice shaky. The child didn't respond. He just smiled, that eerie, vacant smile, and slowly raised his hand, pointing behind me. I turned, and the kitchen was no longer empty. Figures stood in the shadows. Kids, all wearing old-fashioned clothes, some with backpacks, others with their jackets still on, like they had just come from school. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide, and they were all looking at me. Then I smelled it, the thick scent of burning rubber and gasoline. The kitchen felt hot, the air thick with smoke that wasn't there a second ago. I could almost hear the screech of tires, the shattering of glass. The kids took a step closer, their faces twisted with something dark, something desperate. I stumbled back, crashing into the counter. "Janine!" I shouted, my voice cracking with panic. I bolted out of the kitchen, my heart pounding. The diner was empty. Janine was gone, the front door wide open, swinging in the wind. But the man in the booth was still there. He turned to look at me for the first time that night, and I swear to God, his eyes were black, completely empty. "Thursday special," he rasped, his voice echoing like it was coming from the bottom of a well. I didn't stay to hear more. I ran out the door, into the cold desert night. The highway was silent, the diner's neon sign flickering faintly behind me. I got into my car and drove until the sun came up and I couldn't see the diner in my rearview mirror anymore. I quit the next morning, told my manager I wasn't feeling well, that I couldn't do nights anymore. She didn't argue, but every now and then, I think about that man, sitting in the far booth, waiting for a meal that no one makes anymore. And when I pass by the diner on the highway, I swear I see shadows moving inside, long after closing time. The Route 66 diner never really closes, you see. Not for everyone.